You were taught that information moves like water, that it flows freely, finds its own level, and reaches you in its natural state, unfiltered, unmanaged, undirected. You were taught that the news is reported, that the narrative is discovered, that the message you receive is the message that was sent. That is the first and most elegant lie in the architecture of control. Information does not flow, information is routed. And the routing infrastructure, the invisible switchboard that decides what you see, when you see it, in what emotional register it arrives, and whose voice is attached to it when it lands, that infrastructure has no public address. It has no logo. It has no face you can hold accountable. It operates the way gravity operates. You feel it constantly, you cannot see its source. And most people never think to question why things fall in a particular direction. This is part one, and in part one, we are going to do something precise and uncomfortable. We are going to dismantle the belief that you have ever received a message that was not, in some meaningful structural sense, already shaped before it reached you. Not shaped by conspiracy, shaped by architecture. There is a critical difference. And if you miss it, you will spend your entire life fighting shadows instead of understanding the system that casts them. Consider the concept of signal laundering. In information theory, a signal carries two things simultaneously: its content and its origin. The content is what the message says. The origin is who sent it, and origin is everything. Because origin determines credibility, determines emotional weight, determines whether the message is absorbed or rejected by the receiver. The architect understands something that the masses never learn. A message delivered by its true source is a weak message. It carries fingerprints. It invites scrutiny. It can be traced, challenged, dismissed. The moment the receiver can identify the sender, the receiver's defense mechanisms activate. Skepticism engages. The signal degrades, so the architect does not deliver the message. The architect builds a channel. Think of it in architectural terms. You do not carry water from the reservoir to the city in your hands. You construct an aqueduct, a system of legitimate, trusted, load-bearing structures that carry the water invisibly, at scale, without any individual pipe being responsible for the whole. By the time the water reaches the tap, it has passed through so many legitimate structures that no one asks where it originated. They simply drink. This is the mechanical reality of how influence operates at the highest level of the system. The message is introduced at the source, quietly, precisely, with surgical intent. Then it is handed off. It moves through credible intermediaries, each of whom adds their own authority to it. An analyst cites a report. A publication covers the analyst. A commentator references the publication. An institution validates the commentator. And by the time the message reaches the masses, it arrives wrapped in the accumulated credibility of every node it passed through. The original sender is invisible. The message carries no fingerprints. But it carries enormous authority. Authority it borrowed, laundered, and delivered without a single traceable transaction. This is not a metaphor. This is the operational architecture of narrative control. And it functions because of one foundational principle that the system depends on absolutely. The masses are trained to evaluate the messenger, not the message. They are trained to ask not, is this true, but who is saying this? And do I trust them? And the architect has already accounted for that. The architect built the trust infrastructure long before the message was ready to send. You are not receiving information. You are receiving the output of a delivery system you were never shown the schematics for. And here is where part 1 ends, not with an answer, but with the question that makes everything that follows inevitable. If the message was shaped before it reached you, and the channel was built before the message existed, then what does it mean that you believe you formed your own opinion? Think carefully, because the answer to that question is not what you hope it is. The answer is not what you hope it is. Because the answer is this: you did not form your opinion. You were guided to a conclusion that was already prepared for you, along a path that was already constructed by a hand you were never permitted to see. And the mechanism that made that possible operates on exactly 2 foundational principles. Not 10, not 100, 2, because the most durable systems in existence are always the simplest ones. Complexity is fragile. Simplicity is load-bearing. The first principle is what the operator calls credibility arbitrage. Arbitrage, in its original form, is the exploitation of a price difference between 2 markets. You buy low in one place, sell high in another, and pocket the differential without producing anything. The asset itself does not change, only its context changes. And that change in context is where all the value is extracted. Credibility arbitrage works identically. The architect possesses a message. That message, delivered directly, carries low credibility because the source is known, the motive is visible, and the receiver's defenses are active. But the same message, introduced into a high-credibility channel and allowed to travel through it, exits that channel carrying the credibility of the channel itself. The message did not change, the asset did not change, only the context changed. And that change in context is worth more than any advertising budget, any campaign, any direct communication strategy ever devised. This is why the boardroom does not issue statements. It cultivates relationships with those who do. This is why the kingmaker does not write the editorial. The kingmaker owns the relationship with the person who hires the person who edits the person who writes it. By the time the editorial is published, it is 5 transactions removed from its origin point. Each transaction added legitimacy. Each intermediary believed genuinely that they were exercising their own judgment. And they were. That is the precision of the mechanism. The intermediaries are not deceived. They are simply operating inside an information environment that was curated before they arrived in it. The second principle is what the architect calls consensus simulation. The human mind does not evaluate ideas in isolation. It evaluates ideas in relation to perceived social reality. This is not a weakness. It is an efficient cognitive shortcut that served the species well for most of its existence. If the people around you believe something is dangerous, the probability that it is dangerous is statistically elevated. Consensus is a proxy for truth, and in most environments, it is a reasonable one. The architect exploits the proxy. Consensus simulation is the process of manufacturing the appearance of agreement before agreement actually exists, and doing so at sufficient scale and from sufficient directional diversity that the individual receiver concludes, rationally, that the consensus is organic. The message arrives from the left. The message arrives from the right. The message arrives from the institution and from the independent voice, and from the grassroots movement, and from the expert panel. The receiver performs exactly the correct cognitive operation. They look for convergence across independent sources. They find it. They conclude the message must be true. What they do not know, what they cannot know from inside the system, is that the independence of those sources is itself a managed variable. The sources are not coordinated in any room anyone could photograph. They are coordinated by shared access to the same upstream information environment. They all drink from the same aqueduct. They simply use different cups. Now watch how these two principles operate together, not in the abstract, in a scenario rendered with precision. The boardroom has a strategic interest. The interest is specific. A particular regulatory framework must shift. Not dramatically, incrementally. The shift is worth an extraordinary amount to the boardroom. But the boardroom cannot advocate for it publicly without triggering scrutiny. Direct advocacy is the weakest move available, so the boardroom does not move directly. The boardroom activates the operator. The operator does not hold a title anyone would recognize. The operator's function is infrastructure. The operator commissions a research body, legitimate, staffed by credentialed professionals who believe in their work, to conduct a study on the relevant topic. The study is not fabricated. The methodology is sound. But the research question was framed by the operator, and the framing of a research question is everything. A question asked in a particular direction will produce findings oriented in that direction. Not because the researchers are dishonest, but because the question itself is a vector. The study is published. An analyst at a respected institution encounters it and finds it compelling. The analyst writes a commentary. The commentary is covered by 3 publications in the same week, not because the publications are coordinated, but because all 3 publications subscribe to the same wire services, follow the same institutional feeds, and operate inside the same information environment the operator curated. The coverage creates the initial appearance of consensus. Now the executor engages. The executor is the public-facing voice, the commentator, the thought leader, the trusted figure whose audience has already granted them credibility. The executor references the coverage, not the original study. The coverage of the study, because the coverage carries more social proof than the study itself. The executor's audience hears a trusted voice, referencing multiple credible institutions, all pointing in the same direction. Consensus simulation is now complete. Credibility arbitrage has been executed across 5 transaction layers. The boardroom's interest has become the audience's informed opinion. No fingerprints. No traceable transaction. No moment where any individual participant did anything other than their job. And the regulatory framework begins to shift. This is not a hypothetical architecture. This is the standard operating procedure of power, at the level where power is actually exercised. The masses believe influence is purchased with money spent on obvious messaging. The architect knows that influence is constructed, built into the environment long before the message is ready to travel, so that when the message moves, it moves like physics, not like persuasion, like gravity. You do not argue with gravity, you do not debate it. You simply fall in the direction it was already pulling you. And in Part 3, we will answer the only question that remains. Not how the system works, you now know how it works. The question is, what does it mean to operate inside it with your eyes open? And what does the architect know about you that you have not yet admitted to yourself? You do not argue with gravity. You do not debate it. You simply fall in the direction it was already pulling you. And the architect has been studying the direction you fall for longer than you have been aware you were falling. This is the part they do not tell you, not because it is hidden behind a locked door, but because the information is useless to you without the framework to hold it. And the framework was never made available to the masses. Because a resource that understands its own function inside a system becomes immediately a liability to that system. Here is what the architect knows about you. The architect knows that you believe you are a critical thinker. That belief is not incidental. It is load-bearing infrastructure in the control architecture. Because a person who believes they are immune to manipulation does not audit their own conclusions. They do not trace the origin of their assumptions. They do not ask who constructed the information environment. They formed their opinions inside. They simply point at the people who are obviously being manipulated and feel the warm, disabling comfort of contrast. You are not them, you are awake. And that belief, that precise, flattering, self-administered belief, is the most elegant trap in the entire system. The architect does not fear the person who is angry. Anger is energy without direction. The architect does not fear the person who is suspicious. Suspicion without methodology is noise. The architect fears exactly one type of mind. The mind that has internalized the architecture of the system so completely that it can read the signal beneath the signal, that can identify not just what message is being delivered, but which layer of the delivery infrastructure it is currently passing through. That mind is not an audience, that mind is a peer. And the question this entire analysis has been building toward is not whether you can identify the system. You can. The question is whether you are willing to accept the full implication of what identification requires. Clarity is not free. This is the tax the system levies on those who attempt to exit the position of resource and move toward the position of architect. The tax is not paid in money. It is paid in the loss of a particular kind of comfort, the comfort of received consensus. The comfort of knowing what to think because the environment around you has already organized itself into a legible signal. When you understand how consensus simulation works, you can no longer experience consensus as evidence. When you understand how credibility arbitrage works, you can no longer use the identity of the messenger as a proxy for the validity of the message. You are forced, at every encounter with information, to perform the slower, more expensive cognitive operation. Trace the origin, map the channel, identify the transaction layers, and evaluate the message on its structural merits rather than its borrowed authority. This is exhausting. It is meant to be. The system is not designed to be easy to exit. The friction is the mechanism. Most people, when they feel that friction, conclude that the effort is not worth the clarity. They return to the consensus. They drink from the aqueduct. And the system registers their return as confirmation that the architecture is functioning correctly. The few who sustain the effort long enough to build the habit, those few do not become cynics. Cynicism is just another managed position. The cynic believes nothing, which means the cynic is just as easy to root as the believer. Because the cynic's rejection of all signals is itself a predictable variable the architect has already accounted for. The cynic is not outside the system. The cynic is the system's release valve. The mind the architect cannot root is the mind that evaluates structurally. Not emotionally, not tribally, structurally. So what does it mean to operate inside this system with your eyes open? It means accepting that you will never receive a message that has not passed through architecture. It means accepting that the goal is not to find the pure, unmediated signal. That signal does not exist at any scale relevant to the world you operate in. The goal is to become fluent in reading the architecture itself, to see the aqueduct, not just the water, to identify the transaction layers, not just the output. This is the operational posture of the architect. Not paranoia, not withdrawal, structural literacy, the ability to ask at every moment of information contact, What channel is this traveling through? Who built the channel? And what does the channel's existence tell me about the message it was designed to carry? That question, asked consistently, is the single most disruptive cognitive tool available to a mind that refuses to remain a resource. And now the protocol, not philosophy, directives, 3 of them, executable, precise. First, source archaeology. When you encounter any message that arrives pre-weighted with institutional authority, do not evaluate the message at the layer where it reached you. Trace it backward. Identify the publication, then identify who the publication cited. Then identify who commissioned or framed the original research or claim. Then identify what structural interest that commissioning body holds in the conclusion the message delivers. This process will not always yield a clean answer. It does not need to. The act of performing source archaeology disrupts the automatic credibility transfer that credibility arbitrage depends on. It forces the message to stand on its own structural merits, rather than the borrowed authority of every channel it passed through. The architect cannot launder a signal to a mind that is actively auditing the laundry. Second, convergence interrogation. When multiple sources appear to converge on the same conclusion simultaneously, do not register that convergence as confirmation. Register it as a trigger for investigation. Ask not why do they all agree, but where do they all drink from? Map the upstream information environment shared by the converging sources. Identify the common wire services, the common institutional feeds, the common research bodies whose outputs all of them consume. In the majority of cases, apparent convergence across independent voices will resolve into a single upstream origin point, which means the consensus simulation is visible. If you know to look for it at the level of the infrastructure, rather than the level of the output. The moment you can see manufactured consensus as a structure, rather than experience it as social reality, it loses its primary function. It can no longer move you. Third, channel mapping. Before you allow any message to update your model of reality, construct a brief mental map of the channel it traveled through. Who is the executor delivering it? What institution validated the executor? What upstream body provided the institutional content? What interest is structurally served by the conclusion the message delivers? This is not an exercise in dismissing all information. It is an exercise in assigning accurate weight to information based on the architecture of its delivery, rather than the authority of its surface presentation. A message that survives channel mapping, that holds its validity even when its delivery infrastructure is fully visible, is a message worth integrating. Most messages subjected to this process will not survive it. And that is not a reason for despair. That is the system functioning correctly from your position rather than from the architect's. You were a resource the moment you accepted the architecture without reading it. You become something else the moment you do. Subscribe to AXIOM Protocol.